That's the beginning. Well, actually, there is no beginning and end because time is actually a function of the human mind and it's only space-time that exists. That having been said, let me go back to 1905, which is probably where we need to start. The Yerkes-Dodson law, there aren't many laws in the behavioral sciences, and I'm not so sure that this one is also, but what we can say is that there's an inverted U-shaped relationship between performance and anxiety. That is, under most circumstances, not all, but under most circumstances, about 90% of the variance, Yerkes-Dodson works, which means with too low levels of anxiety, we don't function adequately. When the levels of anxiety are too high, we also don't function adequately. So what we're really trying to pull off is optimum levels of stress and anxiety to be able to allow us to perform at optimum levels. So the model that we're really talking about, as I understand it, is an optimization model. It kind of puts us into the issue of industrial engineering. And if you treat the human being and therapeutic interventions as a product, it probably makes a lot of sense. So if I can have the next slide, please. Looking at Yerkes-Dodson in another way, we can, what I've just said, in the context of boredom on the one end to break down burnout on the other end. And what we're trying to do is to optimize growth and learning and the likelihood of our getting into a distress zone. So we're looking at modifying human behavior in some way on the topic of anxiety and stress. Because we're talking about anxiety and stress as it relates to performance, we're really talking about the relationship between cognition and the limbic system, or anxiety itself. So that is between the cortex and anxiety. Newborn infants, I'm a developmentalist, so newborn infants, I'm also the father of 5 kids, so maybe that has something to do with all of this. When children are born, when a newborn infant is a naive instrumental hedonist, he's interested, or she is interested, in satisfying their own needs. Sometime over the course of the first 2 years of life, something happens. That is, there is an integration of the circuitry between the frontal lobes in particular, but not exclusively, but most of the cortical regions, and the limbic system, which concerns ourselves with emotionality, and particularly the amygdala. That process of development doesn't really end until males are in roughly about age 26 and females roughly about age 23. Females' brains mature more quickly than do males, and that's pretty obvious when you take a look at our teenage children or guys, how they drive cars until roughly the age of 26 plus. The actuaries know all about this. So if I can have the next slide. What we do know is that stress that Dr. Wallach had spoken about is not the same thing as a stressor. Stressors are something that, as in terms of Selig's argument anyway, stressors are time limited, and we have them all the time. You're driving a car, someone sideswiped us, and you do not perceive that you are in a state of stress because you're not. You will be reactive, and after the reaction, you have a number of factors that we're trying to get a hold of associated with stress and stressors. 1, an increase in heart rate, fibrinogen level, blood clotting factor, respiratory rate, the pilomotor response, the hair stands on end, respiratory rate, cardiac output, and so on. That's what we can typically call emergency reactions. We cognitively don't get on top of that until roughly some seconds after we've already reacted. However, stress, in contradistinction to a stressor, is anything that's perceived by the organism as being physically and/or psychologically injurious to it over prolonged periods of time. So persistent stress, not only does it mess with your emotional responsivity and right hemisphere functions, such as fibrinogen production, heart rate, respiratory rate, pilomotor response, and all of that, but it also produces a hormone, and that hormone is adrenal corticotrophic hormone, ACTH. ACTH, among other things, is an immune suppressor, and associated with prolonged stressors over a long period of time, is a reduction in your capacity to fight off disease and disorder. So grandma was right when she said, don't go out in the cold without a coat in the wintertime because you might catch the death of a cold. And we intelligent people know that the common cold, is either bacterial or viral, not the cold, but diseases of that kind. Well, grandma was right because our immune system is compromised. We can also say that persistent stress changes brain architecture. And here we can see the difference between, not my work, the difference between normal stressful situations or normal and dendritic connectivities and toxic stress, which in particular has an effect on the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, and we will get to that in a moment. Next slide, please. So I stole this from Dr. Lawless, I think, and this is a schematic, a very simple schematic of the acoustical pathway that we think. Now I'm waving, this is hand waving. I don't know this to be the case, but this is my hypothesis about what's going on, that we're able to directly modulate neural activity in the relationship between the amygdala, which is where prior to the age of 26 in males, you're pretty much reactive through the amygdala, and the hippocampus, which is where memory is initially consolidated and reconsolidated. And that, because of its connection with the limbic system, has an awful lot to do with emotional memories, which are first consolidated there, which, in other words, it derives the makes connectivities between various areas of the cortex and emotional state. So what we do when we learn, what we do when we learn an emotional response, what we do when we are subjected to toxic stress, is we make connectivities that are really hard to break. So emotional memories are consolidated in this pathway we're looking at here, and it's so highly associated with, in EEG terms, what's called theta activity. That allows us to be able to examine changes in brain state that would be associated with such a device. The next slide, please. So here we have an example of brain regions that are correlated with the opposite of what we're looking at. That is, of individuals who are highly resilient versus those who are not. And we have what are called FALFF, which is an engineering term for how it is that we image through functional magnetic resonance imaging, which you see. And what we can see on the right-hand side, which is a little clear, is we have scatter plots of the correlations between these engineering modalities and psychological resilience. So it's relatively easy for us, in large numbers of individuals and participants, to be able to differentiate those individuals who are highly resilient from those who are not particularly resilient, and from those who have become more resilient as a consequence of whatever the intervention might be. The next slide, please. So now we go to the data that we've collected here, and we're looking at an assessment of the global efficiency for functional connectivity. Let me explain what I mean by that. Limited to 3 patients and a normal baseline measure before and after the BAUD treatment. What we mean by functional connectivity as opposed to anatomic connectivity is the following. Neuropsychologists, whom I have a very big issue for about 150 years, mostly since Broca, have assumed that certain areas of the brain are responsible for certain functions. That there's something like hemiplegia, for example, which if you're damaged in one hemisphere, your behavioral effects are lateralized to the contralateral hemisphere in the case of... That's nonsense. It's absolutely not true, because if you have a damaged right hemisphere, you have a damaged brain. And if you have a damaged brain, both sides are affected. Maybe differentially, maybe different things are involved, but it's both sides. So what we're more interested in is how we learn and how the brain puts itself together functionally. And so what we're looking at is not necessarily an anatomical localization of a BAUD effect, but rather how bits and pieces of the brain talk to each other. That is, how they communicate. So we have here a significant difference, and it doesn't take any rocket science to see this, of the functional connectivities graphed between global efficiency and what we call degree change between pre-BAUD versus after BAUD treatment. This means nothing behaviorally. All it means is the brain has changed as a result of BAUD treatment, and that change is consistent over the period of time that we had measured the result. And so you can clearly see the difference between the left-hand side of the slide and the right-hand side of the slide. Can I have the next slide, please? And here we have a graphic representation of patient 1, 2, and 3 before BAUD treatment and after BAUD treatment. And we've done this many, many times on these 3 patients, and the results are consistent. it changes brain state. Does it mean anything? Well, prima facie, no. It just means the brain state has been changed. But in the context of the statistical analysis that Dr. Wallach, that Joe had presented previously, we can clearly say that there's a statistically significant difference behaviorally between what it is that the patients, the function of the patients prior to BAUD treatment and after BAUD treatment in reducing anxiety, not in affecting depression, and by extension, having an effect likely on post trauma, and also by extension on panic. And the reason that panic attacks would be involved in such a conclusion is because panic is anticipated or anticipatory anxiety. So we know that BAUD has an anxiety reducing effect. Why? Well, if we ever get to study the basic mechanisms in the brain about why this is happening, I will tell you then that I still would not be able to answer why, because science doesn't deal with why, but I surely would be able to tell you about what's happening descriptively, what's happening in the brain. So the conclusion is, from my end of the equation, there is a significant change in brain state. Perhaps it's related to something behaviorally or not. However, statistically, we can say that on the basis of changes in paper and pencil evaluations, that there is a significant effect. And with that, therein in the lesson.
Thank you.